They nailed his hands to the wood before sunrise, not because he stole, not because he ran, but because he looked a white man in the eye and did not kneel. By midday, the flies had already found him. His screams rolled across the cane fields like thunder, and no one moved. No one spoke. No one even looked too long, because on this island, even grief could get you killed. Even pity could be punished. Even a mother's tears could be taken as rebellion. So we lowered our heads, and we cut the cane. That was how they taught us to live. Not with chains, not with whips, not even with hunger, but with spectacle. Pain was the language of the colony, terror was its law, and blood was the only lesson repeated often enough for every slave to understand. If stories buried like this deserve to survive, follow and subscribe to Untold Histories TV. This was Saint-Domingue, the richest colony in the world, a place so profitable that Europe dressed itself in our suffering. Their sugar came from our skin, their coffee came from our broken backs, their wealth came soaked in the blood of people they called less than human, and still, they would tell the world we were savage. That was the lie. Not that we were enslaved, not that we were beaten, not even that we were dying by the thousands. The lie was that we were powerless. The lie was that we accepted it. The lie was that freedom came from France. It did not. It came from the hands they tried to break. It came from the mouths they tried to silence. It came from the fire rising in men and women who had already lost everything but rage. And when it came, it did not ask permission. It began in the fields, in the heat, in the rot, in the silence between one scream and the next. And by the time the world understood what was happening, the colonial order was already burning. They stole us slowly, deliberately. First they took your name, then your language, then the sound of your mother calling you home. Then they took the God you prayed to and laughed while they replaced him with theirs. Then they took your body and sold what remained. That was the crossing. You entered the ship as a person. You arrived as cargo, packed in darkness so tight men died standing. Women bled where they lay. Children cried until thirst turned their voices to ash. The dead stayed with us for days. There was nowhere to put them. The smell lived in your throat. The fever lived in your bones. And the men above deck argued over profit while we learned what it meant to survive inside a grave that floated. Some prayed, some went mad, some refused food and chose the sea, some leapt, and for those who could not jump, they waited. That was the first rebellion, not the fire, not the machetes, not the uprising they would later fear. The first rebellion was survival. To wake each morning and still breathe was resistance. To remember your name was resistance. To keep one story alive in a whisper was resistance. To endure what was designed to erase you and remain human. That was where the war truly began. When we arrived, they washed us, not to clean us, to inspect what had been bought. They opened mouths, pressed limbs, checked teeth, measured muscle, turned men like livestock, handled women like property already imagined in violation. The auction was always loud. Laughter, bargaining, boots in dirt, children screaming for mothers sold 3 bodies away, then silence. The kind that comes when a family disappears in separate directions. That silence never leaves you. Mine was taken beside me. I remember her hand slipping from mine. I remember the sound she made when they pulled her away. I remember trying not to move, trying not to scream, trying not to die from the helplessness of still being alive. That was how the island introduced itself. Not with land, not with sun, not with sea, with separation, with ownership, with the slow, methodical destruction of everything human in you. And then came the plantation. Rows of cane sharp as knives, heat that clung to the lungs, mud thick with sweat, blood, and rot, the air alive with insects and the smell of boiling sugar. Work began before dawn. It ended after dark. And if you collapsed before the bell, they made an example of you. Whips for slowness, whips for speaking, whips for standing wrong, whips because a white man woke angry and needed somewhere to put it. There were punishments for theft, punishments for escape, punishments for prayer, punishments for being too proud, punishments for looking too broken. punishments for surviving what should have killed you. They cut ears, branded skin, burned feet, hung men in iron cages to starve above the fields where others worked below. And when they wanted fear to spread faster, they chose spectacle. A body broken in public was worth more than 10 private beatings. That was the arithmetic of terror, and it worked until it didn't, because pain can teach obedience. But only for a while. After enough suffering, fear changes shape. It hardens. It becomes memory, then hatred, then hunger, then something far more dangerous than despair. It becomes clarity. The masters thought cruelty made us less human. What it made us was certain. They believed suffering would empty us. Instead, it stripped away illusion. There is a point in a man's life when he stops asking whether he can survive and begins asking what survival is for. That question spread quietly, in the cane rows, at the mills, in the huts after dark, in glances held too long, in prayers spoken low, in songs carrying messages too old for masters to hear. The island was changing, not above us, below, not in mansions, in whispers. The French drank wine and argued about liberty. They spoke of reason, of rights, of the dignity of man, and still they owned us. That was the second lie. Across the ocean, men in powdered wigs declared freedom sacred, while ships still crossed carrying chained flesh to feed their fortunes. They wrote of equality in ink. We read their truth in blood. And when word came that France was changing, that kings trembled, that power was cracking, that liberty was being shouted in the streets, the planters laughed. They thought revolution was for white men. They thought liberty had color. They thought the language of freedom would stop at the plantation gate. They were wrong. News travels strangely among the oppressed. A word overheard, a page stolen, a servant listening at doors, a rumor passed in market dust, a sailor too drunk to guard his tongue. By the time the masters realized we were listening, we had already begun to understand the shape of their hypocrisy. If all men were born free, what were we? If liberty was sacred, why were we in chains? If France could revolt against a king, why could we not revolt against monsters? The question was no longer dangerous because it had been asked. It was dangerous because too many already knew the answer. And once a people understand that power is not sacred, only enforced, history begins to shake. At night we gathered where the cane thinned and the trees thickened. Not many, never too many, enough to speak, enough to remember, enough to become dangerous. There were those born in Africa who remembered kingdoms, warriors who had seen organized armies, priests who remembered the old rites, women who remembered songs older than the ships, men who had been chiefs, hunters, fathers, sons, before Europe renamed them property. The French saw labor. They did not see memory. That was their mistake. We spoke in fragments, in coded prayers, in proverbs that carried instructions, in rhythms that moved information faster than letters ever could. What looked like worship was planning. What sounded like mourning was strategy. What seemed like submission was patience. The island was listening to itself again, and in that listening, something long buried began to rise. This was beyond hope. Hope is soft. This was harder. This was decision. We would not live forever on our knees. The first time I heard his name, it came in a whisper, not like rumor, like warning. A man who had been enslaved, a man who had known the whip, a man who could read, a man who understood both the language of the master and the hunger of the field. Toussaint. His name moved through the plantation like heat before fire. Not yet legend, not yet liberator, only possibility. And possibility is the most dangerous thing a slave can be given. Because once a man imagines himself free, he becomes impossible to govern the same way again. But Toussaint was not the beginning. That is another lie history prefers. History likes one face, one hero, one name simple enough to teach children. But revolutions are never born from one man. They are born from the accumulation of the unbearable, from mothers burying children, from women violated until grief turns feral, from men worked to bone, from children born into ownership, from old men dying unnamed in fields they did not choose. Revolution begins long before the first shot. It begins when suffering outlives fear. And on this island, fear was dying. The ceremony took place in the storm. Rain cut through the trees. Thunder rolled above us. Mud swallowed our feet. We came in darkness, wet, hungry, silent, men, women, the living, and the nearly dead. We stood beneath the trees while the storm broke open the sky, and for the first time in years, no master stood above us. No whip, no bell, no command. Only breath, only thunder, only the old gods listening. A black pig screamed. Blood met earth, hands lifted, voices rose. What was spoken there was not madness, not superstition, not the savage ritual white men would later describe to make themselves less ashamed of what followed. It was oath. It was memory. It was judgment. It was war made sacred. That night, the enslaved did not become violent. That night, violence was answered. And once spoken aloud, there was no returning to silence. 3 nights later, the first plantation burned. The first fires were seen before dawn. Then another. Then another. Flames tore through cane fields. Smoke climbed into the sky. Plantation houses burned bright enough to turn night into revelation. The masters woke to what they had planted, not revolt. Consequence. The fields that made France rich became walls of fire. Sugar mills collapsed in sparks. Storehouses burst. The air filled with screaming. Some ran, some hid. Some begged the same mercy they had denied for generations. Not all were spared. History prefers softness when the oppressed strike back. It asks whether vengeance went too far. It rarely asks that of the plantation system. No one writes essays demanding moral restraint from the whip. No one asks the plantation to justify its brutality with civility. But when the enslaved answered violence with violence, suddenly the world remembered ethics. We remembered only the dead. The uprising spread faster than command could contain it. That was the terror of it. This was not one plantation, not one grievance, not one leader. It was an entire people reaching the same conclusion at once. Kill the master, burn the fields, break the mill, take the gun, run the horses, open the storehouses, free the chained, move before dawn. What had once been whisper became motion. By sunrise, smoke was already rising across the northern plains, and motion became war. The French were not prepared. How could they be? They had mistaken domination for control. They knew how to punish, not how to survive being hated by everyone beneath them. The colony cracked open. Messengers rode through the night carrying news of burning estates and dead masters. Planters fled. Families vanished. Fortunes burned. Bodies filled roads. The wealth of Europe began to choke on its own smoke, and still the world did not understand. This was not chaos. This was revolution. Not hunger without thought. Not destruction without purpose. This was the enslaved learning that power bleeds. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The French sent soldiers, then more, then more. They came with uniforms and discipline and guns and certainty. They came believing black men could be killed back into obedience. They came believing terror could be restored. They came believing Europe was still inevitable. They learned otherwise. The men they fought were no longer merely laborers with machetes. Many carried cane knives sharpened in secret for years. They were soldiers now, forged by terrain, by necessity, by memory, by the simple knowledge that defeat meant chains or death, and victory meant the impossible. They knew the forests, the hills, the ravines, the heat, the hunger. They knew how to vanish, how to strike, how to wait, how to make certainty bleed. And they knew something no European army ever fully understood. A man fighting for profit can retreat. A man fighting for freedom cannot. That difference remade the war. The French had training. The enslaved had cause. Cause survives things discipline cannot. So the island became a grave for certainty. The war changed everyone. There are things a man becomes in war that do not leave him after. I saw boys become executioners, mothers become scouts, priests become tacticians, farm hands become cavalry, the hunted become hunters. War did not purify us, it transformed us. There is a difference. History loves clean heroes, but revolutions are not clean. They are born in atrocity and forced to survive by becoming harder than the world that made them necessary. There were betrayals, men who sold names for safety, women forced to choose which child to save, allies who shifted with power, promises made and broken in the same breath. The Spanish circled, the British watched, France schemed. Colonial powers smelled opportunity in black suffering and came hungry. Every power wanted the island. None wanted its people free. That was the third lie. The world could tolerate slavery. It could tolerate massacre. It could tolerate colonial brutality on an industrial scale. What it could not tolerate, what truly terrified it, was black victory. A slave rebellion was horror. A successful slave rebellion was apocalypse. Because if Saint-Domingue could rise, every plantation system on earth suddenly looked vulnerable. That was the fear spreading across oceans. Not violence, precedent. The revolution had become contagious, and that made Haiti dangerous before it was even born. Toussaint rose because he understood what victory required. Not rage alone, structure, not revenge alone, discipline, not rebellion alone, statecraft. That was his genius. Others could burn. He could build. He maneuvered through empires like a man walking through blades. French, Spanish, British. He played them against each other, not because they were trustworthy, but because none were. He understood power the way enslaved men often do, not as principle, but as appetite. And appetite can be manipulated. Under him, the revolution sharpened. Armies organized. Command tightened. Discipline hardened. The enslaved became a force Europe could no longer dismiss as chaos. That was when fear turned global, because this was no longer a colony in revolt. This was a black army becoming a nation in all but name, and the world began preparing to strangle it. Napoleon could tolerate many things. He could not tolerate black sovereignty, not in the richest colony in the Caribbean, not in sight of Europe's ambitions, not as proof that liberty might belong to those Europe had enslaved. So he sent ships, thousands of men, cannons, steel, disease. Napoleon believed overwhelming force could restore the colony in weeks. Orders wrapped in diplomacy and sharpened by betrayal, they came speaking peace. That was how power prefers to approach the throat. They promised negotiation, recognition, order. They promised everything except what mattered, freedom. And Toussaint, for all his brilliance, believed for one fatal moment that France could be reasoned with. That was the betrayal, not sudden, not dramatic, worse, polite. He was invited, received, spoken to as a statesman, then seized, taken in chains, shipped across the ocean, buried in cold stone far from the heat that made him. France could not defeat him honestly, so it did what colonial powers do when force fails. It lied. He died in a cell, cold, isolated, removed from the revolution he had helped forge. But by then the mistake had already been made. They took the man. They left the fire. And fire does not return to chains because its first keeper is gone. If France believed Toussaint was the revolution, they had understood nothing. The men who remained had learned too much, lost too much, buried too much. And now France had shown its final truth. There would be no compromise, no coexistence, no negotiated humanity. Only domination, restored or destroyed. So the war became absolute, and the island answered accordingly. Jean-Jacques Dessalines did not mistake French intention for diplomacy. He had seen too much for illusion. Where Toussaint calculated, Dessalines concluded. France had come not to govern, but to re-enslave. There would be no second captivity. That certainty made him terrifying and necessary. The war that followed was not merely brutal, it was terminal. Villages burned, prisoners executed, fields salted by blood. Disease tore through ranks. The French drowned in heat, fever, and the hatred of a people who understood exactly what defeat would cost. Yellow fever killed what black resistance did not. Entire French regiments collapsed without firing a shot. The island itself turned against the invader. Men who survived battle died delirious. Officers rotted in their tents. European certainty melted in tropical mud. Still they fought. Still they butchered. Still they tried to restore a world already dying. The French unleashed dogs, mass executions, terror refined by desperation. They had not come to reclaim a colony. They had come to make an example. Instead, they became one. The final battles were not elegant. No war like this ever is. They were smoke, mud, steel, gunfire, screams swallowed by cannon, men charging through fear because behind them stood not territory, but the memory of chains. Every blow carried generations in it. Every shot answered a whip. Every advance answered an auction. Every death answered a crossing. This was no longer simply war, it was reckoning. And when the French broke, the world broke with them, because the impossible had happened. The enslaved had not merely rebelled, they had won. For the first time, black families walked the plantations without permission. Drums were played openly. Children no longer hid when riders approached. Not pleaded, not petitioned, not waited for conscience. Won. They defeated armies, shattered empire, destroyed plantation rule, and forced the world to witness what it had always feared most. The enslaved were never powerless, only outnumbered, only occupied, only waiting. Haiti was born in fire because nothing else would have allowed it to live. That is the part they soften. That is the part they bury. They will tell you Haiti was born violent. They will not tell you what violence birthed it. They will call it unstable. They will not name the powers that made its survival a punishment. Because even after victory, the war did not end. France demanded payment for its own defeat, for lost property, for lost slaves, for lost profit, and the world agreed. Imagine it. A nation born from bondage forced to pay its former master for the crime of no longer being owned. That was not debt. That was revenge disguised as law. And Haiti paid. In gold, in hunger, in generations. Punished not for savagery, punished for precedent. The world could forgive slavery. It could not forgive its overthrow. So they isolated Haiti, starved it, lied about it, turned triumph into warning, turned resistance into cautionary tale, turned the first Black Republic into a global example of what happens when the enslaved win too completely. Erase the cause, preserve the consequence. That is how power writes history, and still Haiti endured, not untouched, not unbroken, but undeniable. Haiti stands as proof of something the powerful have always needed forgotten. The oppressed do not need permission to become history. They only need memory strong enough to remember what was taken, grief deep enough to name what was done, and courage fierce enough to answer. Because Haiti proved something the world has feared ever since. The enslaved were never powerless, only waiting. Follow and subscribe to Untold Histories TV for the stories power tried to erase